the other procedures that we perform within the laboratory, one thing that we did not mention is that at this point in the process, we are strictly doing evidence collection. I think as trace examiners and as you have found, we have a skill in that we can recognize things at a small level and be able to potentially differentiate between what those materials may be even before we get them into a controlled setting in the laboratory to be able to perform further analyses on those. And so one thing we want to reiterate is that while we're doing collection of materials off of bodies in the morgue, because Texas, we also have a Department of Public Safety division of which many of their members are represented here. A lot of the bodies that we work, the agencies may not actually be using our laboratory for their services. This portion of what we do as trace examiners is strictly related to the medical examiner's office. So we do have bodies that come into our morgue that the agencies, for whatever reason, may not be utilizing our services in our laboratory, but may be sending those to other laboratories throughout the state and to states outside of our jurisdiction as well. So when we talk about collection of trace materials in the morgue, we are simply doing an evidence collection process at this point. But certainly as trace examiners, I think we have the ability to recognize certain types of evidence and the potential value of those for further analysis in a controlled setting in the lab. So some of the things that we look at in that collection process, we try to do it methodically. We start either at the head end or the foot end. We are doing it, since it is just Pat and I, we've been working together for 10 years on bodies in the morgue, and we can pretty much read each other's minds at this point. One of us, we may both start at the head and work our way down. She's on one side of the body, I'm on the other, or we're working at two opposite ends in order to meet in the middle. Constantly communicating throughout the process what we're finding, what we're seeing, so that we can then do the best thorough evaluation that we can. In that head-to-toe examination, we're looking for all sorts of materials, and we are going to be using the D word frequently through here because, again, this is the evidence collection process. And as we all know, sometimes trace examiners are in a better position to collect that type of evidence even than some DNA analysts are. And so what we want to do is we are looking for any type of impression evidence. We're going to be recovering gunshot residues. Those impressions, by the way, could be on the clothing items of the decedent. They can actually be on skin surfaces of the decedent. If there are any ligatures involved, we're going to be looking very closely at those ligatures, recovering trace materials in the morgue, and also collecting those ligatures in such a fashion so that they can be processed more thoroughly once they make it to a laboratory. We're going to be looking at the wounds very closely, depending on the type of case that we have, whether it be blunt force trauma, gunshot wounds. We're going to be looking very closely at those wounds for the types of materials that we would expect to see around those wounds and doing recovery within the wound margins and things like that. Tapes and things a lot of times are associated with bindings, and so we're certainly going to be looking at those materials as well. Hairs and fibers, certainly a normal portion of what we expect to see on bodies. And Ms. Eddings and I, in doing bodies over the years, we actually prefer to do tweezing. So that's going to be one of the main methods that we use. We do some level of tape lifting. However, we find that tweezing tends to be very effective. Tape lifts can be performed once that garment is brought into the laboratory if necessary. And again, we are doing an evaluation of these items and items that can be easily lost. If we feel like the trace materials that we see are in some way embedded in the material itself, we're not going to spend a lot of time recovering those materials in the morgue. We'd rather be doing that in a controlled environment in the laboratory. So paints, polymers, any sort of schmeggy looking residues that are on skin surfaces, we want to be sure and collect those as well. And there's a lot of things, folks, that's in the morgue that is just schmeggy looking residues. We don't know what they are, but we know that there's a potential. Maybe they don't look like blood, they don't look like anything biological, but we don't know yet. So we'll go ahead and recover those. We look at it like this. You know, a lot of you know in crime scene, you get one shot because you don't know what you're going to get. You don't know if you're going to get a search warrant to come back at a later time. In the morgue setting, it's very much the same thing. In about 12 hours, this person is going to be, 8 feet under potentially. So this is your one chance to get everything you need. And if anything, we get a lot of flack for how much we collect, but I would always rather have too much than not enough. We look at glass particulates, certainly in the case of hit-and-run victims, glass being a very important aspect of that. Biological materials. We are doing the recovery of the sexual assault kits. We are doing the recovery of any other residues found on the body that could potentially be biological in nature. So just to give you some lovely photographs to go with your breakfast this morning. This is certainly an example of blunt force trauma. Anytime we're seeing lacerations like this to any area of the body, we are thinking specifically whether we know what the weapon was, whether there was a weapon found at the scene. We are thinking if this is some sort of a linear object that potentially came into contact with this surface, was it a painted object? Could it have been wooden? Would we find potentially wood particles along the margins of those wounds? Could we find paint along the margins of those wounds? Are we having any impressions along the outside surface area of that wound as well? We're going to do extensive photographic documentation and visual examination of those areas to recover those types of materials. We have a lot of impressions that show up on bodies for various reasons. In hit-and-run accidents, and if the vehicle is found at the scene and it's really kind of a no-brainer situation, impressions may not be as significant, but we're still going to photograph those. Certainly, impressions can give you an idea as to what type of object may have potentially created those impressions. When you're seeing linear marks like this, we're thinking some sort of belt, some sort of strap, some sort of rope or cord might have been used. And this is information that we can relay directly and immediately to the detectives or to the officers that we're working with so that they can start looking for those types of items potentially back at the scene. Many times while we're working the body, the scene is still being processed. And so this is information that potentially we can provide. Certainly if we're finding someone comes into the morgue wearing a black shirt and we find all these red fibers all over it, we're going to let the detective know that and say, you know, we're seeing all these red fibers on there. Is there something at the scene that had red fibers, which would be easily explained? Or if they can't find anything in the scene that goes with all these red fibers that we're seeing on the shirt, that's an indication that potentially once they develop a suspect, we need to be looking for these types of items in the field. So certainly this is something that we can help to provide. This is another case where we had some very unique impression marks on the torso of a woman that was brought into the morgue. This lady was found in the home of the suspect in the case. If you can tell, the breast area is on the right-hand side of the photograph and her navel is here on the left. So this is all covering the entire abdominal surface of the decedent. Very interesting marks, and we're thinking, wow, you know, you kind of see herringbone pattern here, but it's very large because it is covering the whole surface. There's some overlap of impressions, but not a whole lot. And so we're thinking it's got to be some sort of large object. We had no idea what these impressions may be, and quite frankly, we still don't have any idea because we could not find anything from the scene that we could relate to these impressions. We looked at 13 different pairs of shoes from the suspect. He had a motorcycle. We looked at the tires on the motorcycle, if he potentially had rolled up onto the decedent. We looked at a bicycle tire in his home. Lots of interesting markings. The one thing we found out later from the suspect's girlfriend was that there was one item in the house that she had seen before, but that wasn't there at the time of the incident, and that was a very ornately carved wooden lamp, where the lamp base and the lamp itself was completely missing. Of course, they never were able to track that down. These are wonderful impressions, and if you are doing photography correctly, you can certainly potentially be able to trace that back to its origin, and certainly do DNA. Bite marks, we're going to do swabs of the bite marks. That's something that we want to be sure and focus on, and then odontologists would then look at that further potentially. Just so you know, this is a child who is still living, and if you'll notice the size of those bite marks, they're actually another child's, which may seem horrific until you've met my two children and realize. Certainly small particulates such as paint found on hit-and-run victims. Again, these are materials that once you remove the clothing from an individual, they can be lost on the gurney and may or may not be collected routinely by pathologists. So being able to do this type of examination in the morgue is certainly helpful. We have recovered on this particular individual a lot of particulate material inside the shirt of the pajama top that certainly looked visually consistent with popcorn material. Looking at the bottom photo on the right, this is actually a piece of popcorn that was found from the decedent's mouth, loosely found inside the oral cavity. The photograph in the middle on the bottom are materials that were recovered from the clothing. And then on the left, Ms. Eddings had the wonderful job of picking through the gastric contents to determine whether popcorn had been eaten recently, which became a very significant factor in the case. Again, we're going to look very closely at the hands. We're going to be picking for particulates and residues. We're going to be recovering gunshot residue kits. And we're also going to be swabbing for DNA among the hands and also the rings. Many of you may not be aware, property on homicide victims, rings, jewelry, a lot of time is recovered and handed back to the family. And so we try to swab those in the morgue. If they're certainly a family heirloom, we try to be cognizant of that because many times, as you know, these materials, once they get entered into evidence, nobody's going to see them for 5 or 6 years potentially. So we want to swab those in the morgue and then be able to release those or potentially retain those for DNA analysis. If we are doing GSR recovery in the morgue, the nice thing about this is if we see blood on the hands, we can actually try to avoid those areas so as not to, goop up your SEM sample. Certainly if the hands are completely bloody, that's going to be unavoidable. Ligatures, this is a good example of ligatures and jewelry. Sometimes that's excessive, and there's certainly a great potential for DNA as well as tissue and all sorts of things to be recovered from that environment. We can also get an indication from the hands whether the victim may have fought back. Certainly in a situation like this where you've got the total removal of an acrylic nail, that's information that we can provide to the investigators that this may be something they want to be looking for at the scene. That's certainly a perfect thing for physical match as well as DNA recovery.
We only have about she's so tall. We only have about an hour and a half left, but I'm going to do this in wrapping up time here. Okay, gunshot residues, again, very important. Just last week, I had a case where the pathologist thought it was a distant range wound, but in looking at the clothing, we were able to help him understand it was a close range wound because of the amount of gunpowder present. We go down, maybe this is stippling from some other source than gunpowder. Maybe there was an intermediary target, such as a door. They ask us to pick the particulates from these little tiny wounds and take them back upstairs and identify them. So we have lots of those kinds of cases that we go through looking for these kinds of material, little tiny microscopic pieces. We do the sexual assault kit in many, many cases, getting all of these types of evidence, looking for everything that we can that will associate a perpetrator back to the scene, using alternate light source to help us locate where these stains may be. In this particular case, we had one stain on the inside of the thigh that was the second perpetrator. The other perpetrator was in her mouth, in her vagina, and in her anus. This was the only spot where the other perpetrator was, and we found that using ALS in a stain on her leg. We're going to take custody of those swabs and make sure that they are securely handled. Yeah. We do all of the clothing. We wrap it up. We lay it out to dry if that's necessary. We're going to recover stains. We're going to do all of those things that have to be done, looking at firearms evidence, looking at trace evidence materials, looking at impressions, making sure that all of these materials are secured in the way that they should be secured so that our lab or another lab, and I wish you'd take some of this evidence, will do these exams and get the answers that need to be gotten. In retrospect, as we look back at all of these things, we stop at the end of it and we ask ourselves, have we done everything? This is a literal step that we do. Do we need to call the latent fingerprint examiner to come down and do patent prints or latent prints from this body? Do we need to call somebody else to do something? Do we need to call a blood spatter expert? We do all of that in assisting our pathologist. This is just a case we were going to do a little case study, but this young girl came in. She was wrapped in a swimming pool liner, and we had to meticulously unwrap her layer upon layer. She was in sheets, and find the evidence that was inside. Ultimately, this man pled guilty, but they were ready to do DNA on that plant material to associate her back. Maybe somebody else would have thrown that leaf away. It turned out to be from a house plant in the house of the man that had killed her. And we are hoping that we have not left you like this. We are hoping you're all awake, ready to go on with your day. We thank you so much for the opportunity to have been here with you this morning. And, you know, we are trace examiners. We just wanted you to know that we work in a lot of pubic care, and it's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it, right? Thank you. Thank you very much.